Here's how to make jalapeno cheddar sourdough bread. To commemorate my recent move from Chicago to Arizona, I'm happy to be making this Southwestern inspired loaf. Start by adding 300 grams of water to a mixing bowl. Then add 10 grams of salt. I'm using kosher salt, but you could use sea salt as well. Then add 100 grams of sourdough starter. I took 25 grams of starter out of the fridge the night before, then I fed it 50 grams of water and 50 grams of bread flour, and the next morning it had risen to double in size, and I added 100 grams of it to this bowl. Well, a little over, but that's fine. And then I had 25 grams of starter left in this jar, and I just moved it back into the fridge. Stir all of this together with the stirring instrument of your choice. You just want to dissolve the salt and starter into the water. When the water looks milky like this, you can move on to the next step. Add 50 grams of whole wheat flour to the mixing bowl. It's probably safer to pre-weigh your flour in a separate bowl so you don't overshoot the 50 grams and have to pull flour out with your hands like this. But hey, I didn't start baking sourdough bread to play it safe. Once you've got your 50 grams of whole wheat flour in the bowl, add 400 grams of plain white bread flour. I'm using King Arthur brand in the blue bag, but any bread flour should work fine. Mix all the ingredients together with a spoon or your hands until it forms a very shaggy dough. Your goal here is to get rid of as much of the dry bits of flour as you can. The dough doesn't hold together very well at this point, but after some stretch and folds and some rest periods, you'll see how this dough transforms. Cover up the dough with a kitchen towel and let it rest on the counter for 30 minutes. During this time, the flour will hydrate and the gluten will get stronger. And you can see here the dough just holds together a little bit better than it did before. Now it's time for the first set of stretch and folds. Just grab an edge of the dough, pull it up and fold it over the top. Then go to the next edge, do the same thing, stretch it up and fold it over the top. Then keep going around the bowl doing the same thing 10 to 12 more times, grabbing an edge, stretching it up, and folding it over the top. Eventually you'll feel the dough start to get smoother, hold together better, and start to resist your stretching and folding. At that point, you can stop, cover up the dough again, and let it rest for 30 minutes. During this rest period, you can start preparing your jalapeno cheddar mixture. For that, you're going to need one fresh jalapeno. I think this tastes way better than using pickled jalapenos from the jar. The fresh jalapeno gives you a roasted, almost sweet type of heat that you'll taste throughout the entire loaf of bread. Next, you'll need an 8-ounce block of medium or mild cheddar cheese. Those will melt way better than the sharp cheddar cheese. You can use that if you want to. You could also use white cheddar cheese if you wanted to, but visually it doesn't stand out as much when you cut open the final loaf of bread, so I prefer yellow. Whatever you do, don't use the bagged shredded cheddar cheese because it has all of this stuff in it. To prepare the jalapeno cheddar mixture, dice up the whole jalapeno and remove the seeds because those aren't good to be chewing on in your bread. You can remove the rib, the white part as well if you want to reduce the heat, or leave that in if you want it to be a little bit hotter. Then take the block of cheddar cheese and divide it in two. You're going to take half of the cheese and dice it really finely into small pieces, and the other half is going to be in larger cubes. The finely diced cheese will melt more evenly throughout the entire loaf, giving it a cheesy flavor, and the larger chunks will give you some bigger, melty pockets of cheese throughout the loaf that I really like. Mix all of the inclusions together as evenly as you can, because you're going to be adding this during the next two sets of stretch and folds. After that 30-minute rest, uncover your dough, and then place half of the jalapeno cheddar mixture right on top of the dough. You're going to be incorporating these inclusions during the stretch and fold process. For the most even distribution possible, start by pressing down the cheese and peppers into the dough. Your goal here is just to get them to stick to the dough so they don't fall all over the place when you start stretching and folding. Now you're going to do this even more gently than last time. Grab an edge of the dough, stretch it up into the air, and fold it over the top. You see how almost nothing is falling all over the place there? That's what you want. Then give the bowl a quarter turn, stretch the dough up, and fold it over. Then give it another quarter turn, stretch the dough up, and fold it over. You're slowly incorporating layers and layers of jalapeno and cheddar cheese throughout the dough. Then take the last corner of dough and stretch it up, fold it over. You've just done 4 stretches and folds, and the dough looks perfect. You've got layer upon layer of cheese and jalapenos. Cover it up and let the dough rest for another 30 minutes, and then it's time for your last set of stretch and folds. Press the dough down a little bit with your hands to make a flat surface, and then rain down all of the rest of the jalapeno and cheddar mixture. Put it right on top of the dough, Dimple it into the dough with your fingertips again so that everything sticks together. And then do a last set of stretch and folds, grabbing an edge, stretching it up, folding it over, quarter turn, stretch and fold, stretch and fold, stretch and fold. You should do another 4 stretches and folds, incorporating the rest of the mixture throughout the dough. After this last set of stretch and folds, you should feel a weightiness to the dough. There's a lot that you just folded in here, so it's going to be heavier, obviously, than a regular loaf of sourdough bread. And as you can see, some of the cheese has broken through the top layer of dough, but you also see a lot of chunks that are underneath the skin of the dough. That's pepper and cheese that's well distributed throughout the entire loaf. Now it's time for the bulk fermentation. Cover up your dough and let it rise at room temperature on your counter for about 4 to 8 hours. This is how long it takes for my dough to double in size. It may take more time or less time for you depending on the temperature of your kitchen. After about 6.5 hours in my relatively cold kitchen, the dough had doubled in size and it was ready to shape. So I put the dough out onto the counter for the pre-shape. I like to pre-shape this dough into a round ball, so I just take my hands and cup and pull the dough like this. This just tightens the skin on top of the dough, forming the dough into a ball that can rise upward. This pre-shaping process gives the dough some structure, and it'll actually make it easier to shape into an oval shape later. So let your dough rest for another 30 minutes on the counter uncovered, and then it's time for the final shape. Get a 9-inch oval banneton basket like this, and I'm sprinkling mine with a little bit of rice flour, but you could use a coarse whole wheat flour as well. And then sprinkle a little bit of bread flour on top of the dough. This is my standard process for shaping a batard or an oval shaped loaf. Flip the dough over so the floured side is down and the sticky side is up. Then gently press down the dough with your fingertips and stretch it out into a square shape. Just grab the edges of the dough with your fingertips and pull it out into as even of a square shape as you can. Then fold the left third of the dough over the middle third and fold the right third of the dough over that middle third as well. And then grab the end of the dough that's further away from you and roll the dough into a cylinder or a loaf shape like this. Your goal here is to roll a tight cylinder of dough while knocking as little air out as possible. Then grab the flaps that are on the end and tuck them underneath the dough. This will smooth out the ends of the dough, making the final loaf of bread look more attractive. Then just flip your dough upside down so the seam side is facing up and put it gently into your rice floured banneton basket. Now it's time for the second rise, also known as the final proof. To bake this on the same day, cover up your dough with a kitchen towel and let it rise on the counter at room temperature for 2 to 3 hours. You could also do a cold overnight proof, which I'll talk more about in the written recipe linked below. For either method, 30 minutes before you're ready to bake, preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, keeping your Dutch oven inside of your oven to preheat as well. After my dough had proofed for 2.5 hours, it had risen significantly and it was light and puffy to the touch, ready to bake. Take a sheet of parchment paper that's a little bit bigger than your bread dough and flip the dough out onto the parchment. Then get a razor blade or your favorite bread lame that you can score the dough with. I like to score this, like most of my sourdough breads, with one long slash across the top of the dough. Hold the blade at a slight angle as you do so. If you run into any snags like this with a chunk of cheese getting in the way, don't try to cut through the cheese because it won't work. Just continue the score on the other side of the cheese. The bread will burst open along that score mark in the oven just fine. Transfer the dough, parchment paper and all, into your hot Dutch oven, then close the lid to trap the steam, and bake this at 450 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes with the lid on. After 20 minutes, take off the lid to reveal your bread's oven spring. The bread has opened up nicely and it's oozing that amazing melted cheddar cheese. That reminds me, don't bake this without parchment paper under the bread because that cheese will burn on the bottom of your Dutch oven. Now continue baking for another 15 minutes at 450 and your bread should end up looking like this. If this isn't dark enough for you, you can keep baking until you've got the color that you're looking for. Let the bread rest on a wire rack or on your stovetop for about an hour before you slice in. I think the melted cheese and the speckled green jalapeños make this a really interesting loaf to look at, both on the exterior and the interior. Speaking of the interior, time for a crumb shot. The crumb is still fairly light and airy considering all of the cheese and jalapenos that are packed into this loaf. You can see that the smaller diced cheese has mostly melted into the loaf and those larger chunks have created pockets of melty cheese. The best way I can describe the flavor of this loaf is it's a sweet heat that's also creamy. To me, the jalapeno flavor in this is perfect. It's sweet and roasty and it balances perfectly with the creaminess of the melted cheddar. I will definitely be making this loaf of sourdough bread again soon, soon, and I hope you do too.